Okay, folks, if you still want to fill up your plate with some of the delicious foods we have here and some dessert and refreshments, and I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Eynon, who is partly at the same institution as I am, the Department of Education, but most of her work is at the Internet Institute in Oxford. Her research focuses on learning and the internet and the links between digital and social inclusion. Since 2000, it has focused on these themes in a range of settings like higher education, schools, and the home, and different life stages, so both childhood, adolescence, and late adulthood. Rebecca is co-editor of Learning, Media and Technology and co-authors of Teenagers and Technology, published by Routledge in 2013. She held a prestigious British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship to explore the links between internet use and social mobility in Britain between 2013 and 14. And I think this is part of what we will hear today, some of the outcomes of your fellowship today. So, big data for tracing learners over time, is this a promise or peril? So, she has in store for you kind of the bigger picture, societal dimension of using big data in learning institutions. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Lars. So perhaps I should apologise for a slightly negative title and perhaps a slightly negative talk, but I do want to kind of stress really how excited I am about the possibilities of using data to enhance our understanding about learners and learning over time. But I did, as Lars said, wanted to kind of bring to this group a kind of discussion about the wider debates that are going on around big data and education. And because some of those wider discourses are slightly problematic, I think. And I think it's really important for academic groups such as this to really connect with those discourses to make sure that kind of future decisions around the use of data in learning and education are theoretically and academically informed rather than informed by kind of populist notions of what's possible with data. And that's primarily what I'm going to focus on today. So it's very different to the presentations this morning, but I found them really inspirational and really engaging, and so hopefully this just gives us a different dimension to talk about this afternoon. So I basically want to talk about three main things. I just want to talk about these wider discourses that I've mentioned around big data and education, look at some of the challenges about using this kind of data in research and practice, which I know many of you are familiar with, but I wonder how well it translates into policy and practice. And then also highlight the importance of education and research community being at the heart of these sorts of debates. And so when I'm talking about big data, I'm using that as a really kind of quick shorthand for all the kinds of data that we can now collect about people as they go about their everyday lives and learning. So that could be from using their mobile phones, from searching on Google, from tweeting and using Facebook, to large-scale administrative data sets like PISA or the National Pupil Database, but also the kinds of research data that we can now generate, some of which we heard about this morning and in other seminars from this series. So as we know, and as we heard about in the introduction, you know, our lives have got this kind of data is at the heart of many of the things that we do as we go about our everyday lives, whether we're talking to other people, whether we're shopping, or whether we're learning. And data is now kind of almost seen as a defining feature of our times, if you like. So Audrey Waters, who's an excellent commentator on trends in education and technology, she talks about data as the new oil, this idea that data is just so precious to us in our understanding of the world and society that it's you know, something that we all should really value. The private sector has used big data in a variety of forms for a number of years to improve their marketing practices. So really thinking about personalised, targeted interventions to encourage people to buy more products or to engage in certain ways with their commercial services. But we're seeing in all sort of phases of the public sector how we're kind of catching up. So it's being used in health, in public health, for example, but also predicting crime, and education is no exception to that. But what is quite interesting, if you kind of step back from it, is the excitement around big data, just the allure of all these numbers and the size and the scale of the data sets that we can be using. And I just really love this very famous experiment in Nature a couple of years ago, which was quite controversial, this Facebook experiment. But how did the number of people in the experiment become the most important thing in the title? So that's not a very exciting title if you take out 61 million person from it. It's pretty descriptive. And so this idea of the excitement around data means that I think sometimes in policy and practice circles, our excitement then translates into perhaps not as careful policy decisions and practices as we would like to see in academia. We've also had a lot of hype about how big data will be the end of science and the end of social science as we know it. So some of you may be very familiar with this quote from Chris Anderson from Wired way back in 2008. It's quite hard to find it online now, but you can if you search for it hard enough. Where he talks about, correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. We can analyse the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. So basically, we're all out of a job. Like, there's nothing for us to do. We just run the numbers. Now, of course, not many people kind of aspire to that view, but it's interesting how kind of appealing it is, I suppose. In education in particular, what I was really struck by this morning was often when we're talking about using data very carefully to solve particular challenges in education. Whereas if you look at the more popular discourse around data in education, it's seen as a kind of straightforward fix or straight solution to all sorts of problems in education. It's just seen as this generic way of healing all of our problems and all of the challenges that we have. And I just pulled two quotes from an article in Education Week earlier this year, from the founders of Alt School. Now, for those of you who've not come across Alt School, it's an amazing initiative in America where they have really thought about learning analytics. So in each classroom, they have video cameras everywhere looking at every interaction that a child and a teacher makes and recording everything they do online. So they have huge amounts of data about the learning process. And they talk about the power of this data to not just improve aspects of what schools do, but they want a kind of different kind of universe in which schools can exist. They want to transform education. And what's interesting about Alt School and other initiatives like it is that these are not people from an education background. Both of these people are originally from Google. So you're getting quite a range of different parties coming in to talk about how we should be using data in education. Now, as somebody who's based primarily in sociology, I guess, sociology of education, what's been interesting is in other academic disciplines like sociology, there's been a huge debate about what does all this data mean for our discipline, what does this mean for our practice, our academic kind of value, and how do we connect more widely to society? And Savage and Burroughs have been at the heart of this, and they're kind of shaking up sociology to try and get sociology to think slightly differently about what might be possible. And not everybody agrees. There's been a huge debate in sociology about the power of this kind of data. But what I've been struck by, and people here may disagree and I'd be interested for other examples, is that in education I don't feel like we've had such a big debate about the future of data and the future of our discipline. Instead, what we seem to be doing is having quite an instrumental response to what's going on, in the sense of policy and practice being about really thinking about how we can use data to improve efficiency, make things more transparent, support personalisation, but it's quite a passive response in some respects. It's very responsive, as Gert Biester would argue. We're not kind of taking a stand and taking a more responsible response, which says this is the kinds of ways we'd like to use data in the education system. We kind of just accept the wider discourses that are around it. Now, of course, in academia we're not doing this, but I think there's a disconnect between academia and policy and practice in this respect. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we could perhaps be a little bit more responsible in our response rather than a little bit more passive. So in the second part of this talk, I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the challenges that I see for big data in education. And these are things that all of you will be very well aware of, but I think in the wider set of policy and practice are not things that people understand or are perhaps thinking about in enough detail. And so the first thing is, of course, we all know that data isn't a neutral thing. It's not that we have all the data about everything. We're always making choices. It's always constructed. It's always shaped in certain ways. But what's interesting about the ways that technology is developing is that increasingly, we're starting to see more and more data that we can just find. So data like Google search terms or Twitter feeds or Facebook. This is all data that we can just collect from people as they go about their daily lives. And this is very different to data that researchers make, i.e. every time we think about a research question, we always really carefully think about the data that we need. But this kind of increasing emphasis on found data to do education research, which is seen in kind of wider circles, is really problematic, because often that means that you have to negotiate with commercial providers in order to get all the data, so not everybody has access to that data anymore. And of course, that sort of found data favours certain groups over others, so those who are noisier or more active online or who are better connected are going to be better represented in that data. Whereas of course in research terms, with data that's made, we always know what our non-response rates are, or who's not responding, or who's not represented, because we think very carefully about that. Also, this excitement about all these other possible data sources that we could start to use means that there's a risk that the data drives the questions rather than the research agenda. And so then the kinds of questions that we ask become increasingly limited and much narrower. And that, of course, is really problematic for those of us who work in research. And so I think sometimes these kind of ideas about data and education and the models that might be being produced now and in the future outside academic circles, people will not kind of question in the careful way that perhaps we would like them to, or to really think about what that data is, where it came from, and what it really represents. They'll just be excited about the number. I also think there's a question about who's holding the expertise and who's going to be expert in this space in the future. I think it's really interesting the amount of contribution from the commercial sector that are interested in data and education. So the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation see personalised learning as one of their 4 priorities to invest in over the next few years. So that's just one example of how much kind of commercial and funding from outside the research sector is coming into education and data. And I think as more and more kind of data scientists get excited about education, as more commercial companies get involved, we're starting to risk handing over some of our work, if you like, to other people who've not got a background in education and have not got a background in learning sciences. They've got backgrounds in how to manipulate data and build nice models without that kind of subject expertise. I'm also quite struck by how siloed the debates are about using data to enhance our understanding about learning, because it's only happening in certain journals and in certain conferences. There doesn't seem to be a very big general conversation about education and data in the same way as there is in sociology, for example. And increasingly, I think funding for our work is going outside education, as physicists or engineers can kind of evidence that they can also manipulate this data just as well as we can, and so perhaps they also then take some of the cash away from us to do our work. Other issues, I think, are these bigger issues about what does using these sorts of data-informed models in school really look like. And of course it depends on the quality of the models that we're building and who's deciding what's important and what's used, and that's a whole big question that we need to have. But I think it's going to be really interesting, and researchers are only just starting to look at this, is how inequalities in the resourcing in schools will very influence, to a great extent, how they actually use data in schools and how they actually inform their practice. And those schools that are better well-resourced are more able to use data as a useful addition to what they already do, whereas in under-resourced schools they can almost become governed by data, and Martin Lawn and Jenny Oscar have written really nicely about this. And I think there's a problem here that we might be sort of imposing ideas about data and education onto teachers rather than really thinking about the professional knowledge that teachers have and how we might be able to use that in the data models that we create. I'm also really interested in all of this. I mean, I love collecting data about learners. What does it mean to have a feeling of constantly being watched and monitored when you're trying to learn something? So I know that, for example, if I was told how many times I check my email in a conference, I might reduce the number of times I check my email, and that would be a good thing. But if I'm learning something new and I feel like I'm constantly being monitored in terms of how I'm going about that, then it might make me more resistant to trying something out or trying something more experimental because I might look a little bit odd in the kind of wider scheme of data being collected. So I think we need to really think about how the feeling of being watched might actually influence the learning process. I also think there's some really interesting questions, and I don't think people are asking this yet, is about if we're giving constant feedback through technology to learners about their learning process, encouraging reflexivity, encouraging a sort of really careful approach to learning. What does that mean in the future for lifelong learning and taking responsibility for your own learning if you've always been nudged towards thinking about it through technology? Do we always have to rely on technology to nudge us to think like that? Or would we develop those skills of self-regulation and reflexivity on our own? And I also have some concerns really as we create more and more complex kind of personalised models that might suggest certain paths for different learners to go down. If those paths are successful, what does that really mean? Because being educated sometimes means failing, and so will we be building those sorts of decisions and judgments into the models that we build? And also I think there's all sorts of questions about the wider purposes of education, what we're really trying to do. I think there's all sorts of data that we can now use in the classroom and from young people about how they're using technology, and adult learners as well. But does it mean we really should use it? And this goes beyond kind of ethical questions, but more about whether people have a right to not give their data, or what kind of consent rules we're putting in place, or what kinds of data we really need to build the models that we have. And I think there hasn't been enough of a public discussion about that, and there's quite a lot of fear in the public, I think, about sharing data or what that data might be used for. As we know, data is really important to enhance our understanding of learning and education, but I think there's a slight risk, if academics are not involved in the debate, that it narrows down the purposes of education, what education is for, perhaps to a more kind of economic, short-term argument over a wider discussion about what education should be. And I think there's also some really interesting questions around if we can start to identify students who are struggling more effectively with data, what would we actually do with that information? Will we have things in place to really support those students? And in public school settings, that seems perfectly logical, but for example, if you could sign up for an online commercial university, know who is most likely to drop out, do you still take their money? Do you invest their money in making sure they get through that course? There are some bigger social questions here that we perhaps need to start asking. So I think kind of looking to the future, without trying to sort of sound negative, because I think there are lots of exciting possibilities, but these are some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of the wider sociological angle about how we're going to be using data in education. I think it's really central to think about the role of academia, how we develop skill sets amongst all stakeholders, and maybe thinking about a more participatory approach to some of these things. So I think academics are key because we know about all of those problems that I've just mentioned. None of them are particularly new, but I think we have the expertise to really address them. Also, we have a commitment to advancing knowledge, not just impact on practice. And so I think perhaps from the commercial side of things or from the data science side of things, we just want to make a difference now, whereas academics might want to make a difference in 10, 20, 30 years, and that's really important for thinking about education as it moves forward and the future of our educational practice. And I also think we're quite key in terms of translating our understandings of how this data is being used to teachers and to policymakers and to data scientists in ways that are really effective, because I think sometimes that translation role is not really happening at the moment. So I think it's easy sort of to say that all stakeholders need skills and knowledge to be part of this debate, but I think we really need to think about what skills and knowledge different actors need, and how far on the continuum do people need to be in order to be part of this debate. Obviously there are things like team working and talking across different stakeholders, but also there's some basics here about understanding what data is, understanding the analysis and how it's interpreted, that are really key. And this doesn't mean you have to know all of the methodology or all the fancy statistical modelling in order to do this, but you need to have enough of an understanding to have that conversation and judge the extent to which it should be used within schools or within policy or whatever. And that's something that's really hard to get right. And I was quite struck, this is a table from Williford and Henry, who used the example of the table as for a multidisciplinary team of people working together, so you need all legs of the table in order for it to work. Well, I think it's similar when we're thinking about data in education. We need the policymakers, the practitioners, the academics and the data scientists all to come together to make this table so that it all sort of is stable and works in the same sort of way. I think one way to really do this is to start to use much more participatory approaches to data in education that allows for different types of expertise and different types of conversations to go on about what we want to achieve and what we want to collect. And this, through practice, I think, would encourage people to have a more nuanced debate about data in education than we're having in many circles at the moment. And it also means that people start to own the decisions being made a bit more. So I think if teachers were involved in the process, then they would start to realise that their knowledge still is relevant and matters, and they might start to use some of these tools and dashboards and all the rest of it that's open to them much more in their practice. And through this we could develop both theory and practice over time. So I think through this kind of more participatory work, then hopefully we'd be able to take a slightly more responsible approach to big data and education, rather than just kind of responding as I think some areas of policy and practice are at the moment. Thank you. And I think I'll just leave it there. And this is the link to the website where we're sort of thinking through all of these issues, so please do get in touch if you have any thoughts or research you could share, or feel free to email me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this big picture scope. Much needed, I think, in the seminar series, the first really big scope. So questions and queries for Rebecca, commentaries, if you go.
Very provocative thoughts, and I mean, where are the big data in education? So there are big data in health, obviously. Yes. There are big data in, let's say, social networks. There are big data in the business industry. Most of that is not accessible. Mm-hmm. Where are the big data in education? Except for, let's say, these movement towards computer-based, technology-based learning environments. Yes. But at present, I mean, schools, where are the big data in today's schools? I mean, you cited an example of a school producing videos of each and every lesson, but that really is an extreme case, right? I mean, yes. Where are the big data?
I think you're right. In schools at the moment, it's still quite rare, and it's still these kind of novel schools which are collecting all this data and starting to decide what to do with it. I think with the whole massive open online course movement in higher education, people have got very excited about using learning analytics in educational contexts. And I think that's trickling down into schools. So there are some US companies now that are offering very kind of adaptive and targeted ways of supporting learning in schools, which are using kind of big data approaches. But I think this talk is more to say, I think this is coming, and to really sort of try and address it now, rather than to allow it to kind of just escalate. So a lot of the hype is there, but the practice is not yet there, and I think we could shape it at this moment.
Yeah.
This is kind of follow up to Reinhard. Sorry, unless.
Me too, but I'll go
okay.
Go ahead first.
I'm not sure I understand the definition of what a big data set is, or big data constitutes, but I think the National Pupil Database, certainly as far as England goes, so this tracks every single pupil, right from the age of, somebody tell me, the age of 3 up to the age of 18,
okay,
or whenever it is that they leave education.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these sorts of, but I think it could get much more. We could look at much more real-time data collection and more sort of process data. So I think, like the National Pupil Database, for example, is a really amazing resource. And that's one type of administrative data that I would count as big data. But I think if you could start to connect real-time process data with some of those outcome data, as we've heard about this morning, then you start to get some really, really exciting, as we've heard, ideas. So we have a lot in place, particularly in the UK, in terms of administrative data. We have lots of ability to collect all this other kind of data, like Google searches, Twitter, Facebook, any kind of interactions on phones, so who's talking to who, but we're not necessarily applying it straightforwardly to education yet. But I think we could very easily, or people will start, and we need to think about, well, which bits of those data make sense for us and which doesn't.
I think you can argue the National Pupil Database is exclusively answering educational questions.
Oh yes, yes, it is, yeah.
But they're questions that are driven by the needs and wishes and so on of the Department for Education.
Yeah.
Rather than, so I mean, you know, to tying it back to some of the provocative questions that you were posing, it's just been done for a different purpose than what academics would like to use it for, which are all of those interesting bits that you just added on the end of.
And so that's, I think that's the interesting thing, is that all of this data is shaped in some way, isn't it? And it's making sure that we can shape it in the way that we would like it to be used and to have more part of that debate.
So a parliamentary pressure group.
But there's actually been, I don't know if I put this slide, but there's a huge amount of debate in sociology more generally about what is big data, because it's not a small question in terms of what counts as big data. And so Rob Kitching, for example, would be a good place to start. He has this kind of nice definition of all the different aspects of what makes data big, and you could kind of go from there. But there's a very big debate. We can't just say it's like a big data set, it has to have these other features as well.
Could you share some of those?
Yes,
features?
yes,
Yeah.
I think I could actually.
So just... Okay.
So, here's a slide I made earlier. I'm quite pleased with that. I didn't know if I had them here, and I just thought, well, I'll just try. Yes, so this is from Rob Kitchin, who talks about the 7 traits of big data. And so it's not just big. He talks about, obviously volume is the big bit, but then there are things about being created in real time is something very important to him. So for Rob Kitchin, administrative data like the National Pupil Database isn't quite counted, but there's other sources I could give to pass around about how administrative data is one type of big data. And this very different idea that you're capturing all of the data about population rather than having to infer it from a particular sample, and so on. You can read all of those different points. But I think this is quite a good definition because it starts to sort of be slightly more precise about the terms.
So this is like real-time PowerPoint preparation. So someone asked you instantly developed the slide.
Yeah,
that was Steve.
Yeah, I planted that. It was like, no, that's my only extra slide. Sorry, you've been trying to ask.
No,
over there,
yeah, thank you. No, it's just, I think it's really relevant what you're saying. I happen to know of someone who's a computer, like he works in IT. His company is working with schools in the UK and just kind of data mining, and they get extremely good access.
Yeah.
They get everything the school has on attendance, on achievement tests, on everything. And then they kind of look for patterns.
Exactly.
So I was kind of saying, well, maybe you should hire an educationalist to give you some ideas of what to look for, because it's really interesting. Because I mean, we probably shouldn't be scared of lots of people looking, but we need to sort of make people aware, or the public aware, of the need to look at theories driving our questions.
Exactly.
Because otherwise they're going to find some kind of correlations.
Yes, they're going to find something.
That experience that you've just described there is driven by an Ofsted. And I'm, then I get a bit ideological with them, because what these companies are doing is helping schools to be able to present the kind of data that Ofsted wants to see, to stop them going into social measures, to allow individual teachers now to enhance their pay.
Because this company seems really ideological. They really want to help schools. They're working with schools, but there's not that
they want to
education
help
in the
them do
background.
what though? The overall question is being driven by accountability, by high stakes testing agenda, and some very, very, very narrow definitions of what counts as educational success.
And I think that's the challenge, is that you have all these talented people from outside education who can scrape all sorts of data, do very sophisticated things with data, but they don't have an educational background, and so we're not having enough of a conversation about, well, what is it that we want to measure better, and how could you help us achieve those sorts of things? There's a huge amount of implicit values embedded into all of the things that are being built, but nobody's really talking about that, about these implicit values, about how what they perceive education to be, or what matters in an education is what they count. And because schools are not very skilled, they're not very often able to talk in depth about the choices that are being made in terms of what data is being used and what data isn't. And so I just think it's a really interesting time, because listening across the whole 6 seminars, there's so much expertise here and so much knowledge that perhaps isn't translating into these other companies or data scientist groups that we need a bit of crossover. Yes, Wayne.
Well, I think what you're saying, I completely chime. And I think that the interesting, you said academics, as if it was one group of people called academics. Yeah. And I just draw your attention to a particular research lab in the UK that I know of rather well, that sets itself up, and it says here, our mission is to understand and develop digital technologies to support and transform education and beyond. So this is a group of pretty clever academics, frankly, and there are no educationists in there.
Yeah.
So it's not just
no, that's right.
outside,
It's
inside
exactly.
as well.
I made that distinction a little bit too neat.
So in my area, econometricians are increasingly colonising, and so one of my research studies was looking at the effects of delaying children's entry to school. They're sort of on the cusp of the cut-off age group and so on, and our research found a set of findings. There was some economists analysed not the same data but similar data and drew almost opposite conclusions. And when we interacted with them, they were saying, "Oh well, we constrained this and we fixed that," and because so they brought various assumptions, they controlled various factors to lead to quite a different. And as an educationalist, I said, but those controls don't actually happen in schools.
Yeah.
These kids are free flowing, and you've turned them into someone they're not. But they provided quite powerful arguments. But as someone who spends a lot of time in schools, I could say, but that doesn't happen.
Exactly.
And so that was a good example.
That's a lovely, yeah. And that's the thing. I think it's not to say these people should not be part of it, because I think they've got incredible skill sets and access to things, data and ideas that we don't have. And I've worked with some data scientists who thought about totally different ways of conceptualizing learning that I've never thought of, and it was exciting to have those debates. But you need to have those conversations, and I think at the moment we're not having enough of them, and we're not involving everybody in the same conversation. So I think it's also teachers, it's also policymakers, it's everybody in the same case.
I think you and Keith at the has talked about this to our group of PhD students, was talking about, and it was quite scary to hear because he was doing lots of participatory research in government, and all the decisions were being made by economists. And part of that problem was possibly educationalists historically having trouble with engaging with numbers, which is what the politicians wanted to know about.
Well, economists and econometricians are very good at the instrumental side of it, as you were saying. And so they pursue questions that are very compelling. I'm not saying erroneous or flawed, but very compelling for certain lines of thinking.
Exactly, and that's the thing. I think some people are working, and it is just more intuitively appealing, and so they get much more attention at the moment.
Yes, they do.
It's somehow addressing that balance a little bit. So that's kind of. I think it's just something to be. I don't have the answers to it, but I think maybe through participatory design, it's one way of getting at some of it.
The problem is, everyone who's been to school is an expert on education.
Exactly. Everybody thinks they can do.
Just leave it to the academics.
Yeah. I think it happens a lot.
Okay.
Well, I had one more observation, because I work with a lot of these data scientists, and they do something quite different to what we've been doing today. They work with a different kind of class of models. It's like the forests and the nets and all of this kind of thing. They don't so much focus on building these generative kind of causal models like we are, although the econometricians do. The data scientists are kind of like maximizing the predictive accuracy. Those are two very different things, and they're good for different things. But for developing the interventions and targeting things when we want to change outcomes, I think these generating models, this kind of thing that we're talking about, is quite important. But something I told you at the break when my first conversation with deep data scientists, I described some of the kind of intra-individual modeling we're talking about, and he told me it was too careful and too slow because they want to build, just the trees, just maximize the prediction. So they're very different things. I think that they can be complementary. There.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to work out how to do that, isn't it? I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.